Thank you very much. Glad to be in Berlin. It's actually my first time in Berlin. I've been in like 5 or 6 other cities in Germany, but never Berlin for some reason, so I decided I had to fix that. So I'm here to talk a little bit about what it takes to build awesome product teams, and I was glad to see a lot of you are here from ProductTank, and a lot of you are product managers, but I think also for you entrepreneurs out there, figuring out how to build your team and how to set them up for success, or even how you should be thinking about the product approach as you're building your company is obviously incredibly important. So as Lou said, my name's Martin. I'm also known as BFG Martin everywhere, which is Big Friendly Giant for obvious reasons. And you can find me on Twitter and everything else. As Lou said, I started ProductTank in 2010, which was a meetup just for product people. Would have been totally happy if it just stayed about 20, 30 people every month. It has kind of taken off from there. There's 400 people meeting in London tonight, and the meetup is in 105 cities around the world, including Berlin. Out of that, we also spun out Mind the Product, which is the conference that I now run as a full-time job, which is the world's largest with 2 conferences, one in London, one in San Francisco, 1,500 people each. But before that, I was doing product management for nearly 20 years in various startups in Sweden, London, and the US. And when I was at a startup in London called Huddle, which was a B2B software as a service application, this was the team, I had a kind of an aha moment. And that moment was our most successful launch, the best product that we launched in the time that I was there. I didn't write a single story. I didn't do a single wireframe. I didn't do a single mock-up. I had nothing to do with the product that actually shipped out the door. But actually I had a lot to do with it, because I was the one that set up that team, and I was the one that set up the problem for them and made them successful. And I think that's when I realized that product leadership is something very different. Of course, most of the time, the team actually looked like this. And that's part of the product manager's job as well. But really, product leadership is difficult, it's not glamorous, and it's not about product, because it's actually about people. And so setting your team up obviously starts with, like any good heist movie, starts with assembling your team. You have to find your safecracker, you have to find your getaway driver, you have to put that team together. And for us, what that means is really thinking about complementary skills. So a lot of you have hopefully seen this kind of Venn diagram. It's my definition of product management as the intersection of the customer, the technology, and the business. The challenge with this is a lot of people think that that means product teams should look like this. You have to have everything, you have to know everything, you have to be really deeply knowledgeable about all 3 of those areas. But realistically, we all look like this, or we look like this, or we look like this. And the key is to figure out how to make your team work together so that together you have all of those skills. And I think that's one of the big reasons that we probably suffer most from imposter syndrome in the tech industry, is because everybody else knows something better than we do, and it's such a generalist role that can be really crushing. But it's also thinking about diversity in your team. So it's not just thinking about the skill sets they come from, but it's also thinking about what work experience do they have? What industry knowledge do they bring to the table? What background do they have? What culture are they from? What is the life experience? What gender are they? All of those things are important to think about when you put together your team. And again, if a person looks like this, you want to figure out, like, the next hire that you bring onto your team, whether it's a developer, the designer, next product manager, looks a bit like this. So you start complementing each other, and you have different skills, and you bring different contexts to the table. And that's so important when you're in a product role, because at the end of the day, it is all about empathy. Good product is all about empathizing with your end customer, your end user. And the more you can bring context to that table and experience to that table, the more likely you are within that team to be able to empathize with your customer. It's also a team sport, so it's thinking about how that whole team fits together. And there's a famous quote by Marty Kagan, who's probably kind of the godfather of modern product management, which is that if you're only using your engineers to code, you're only getting half their value. And that's true of every role in the company. It's true for your designers. If you're only using your designers to design, you're not getting most of their value. If you're only using product managers to write specs and put them in Jira, you're not getting the value. The key is to bring everyone together into one cross-functional team. Because as soon as you start splitting out into teams, as your company grows, that's when you start getting friction. And when one team has to ask another team for help, there's that little invisible barrier between the teams. And that's when you have to start figuring out queuing systems, prioritization tools, road mapping tools, whatever it is you need to be able to overcome that communication gap. And really what you need to be thinking about is how do I make one cross-functional team that can execute on their goal and has all the skills they need in that team to execute on that goal. A really good example is a startup called TransferWise in London. How many know TransferWise? Fairly common. So it's all about currency conversion. And my favorite example for this is they have a team that just handles currencies. And that team's responsibility is to figure out what markets do they need to go to, what new currency transfer paths do they need to open up. So within that team, they don't just have devs, designers, and a product manager. They actually also have a banker, and they have 2 lawyers, so that whenever they go to a new country, they can open up the accounts, they can set up all the legal agreements, and execute it. They don't have to go to a separate legal department and hand in a request form and wait 3 months to get the right paperwork back. They have everything they need in their team to execute on their goals. So once you've set up your team for success, you need to create their environment. And it's not about having a ball pit in your office. It's not about the ping pong table or the free beer at the end of the day, although those things are nice. It's about thinking about what makes a team successful. How many of you have heard of Project Aristotle at Google? Definitely go look this up. Google, being data-minded as they are, decided to figure out what makes their teams successful. So they looked at all of their teams across the company, looked at all the performance data that they could get for those teams, looked at all the data that went into those teams, and tried to figure out over like a 5-year span what it was that made a team successful. And being Google, they assumed basically the more Stanford engineers you had in a team, the more successful it was going to be. The smarter the people were, the better their qualifications, the better their degree, the better their scores. And what they found out was that that had no correlation whatsoever with success. The number one thing by far, they found 5 things, but the number one thing by a mile is this concept of psychological safety, which basically means that the teams that were most successful were the ones that were happy to disagree with each other, to admit mistakes to each other, to have an argument about the product or the solution or the process. And they were more open, basically, to admitting mistakes, taking on new challenges, and challenging the status quo. And then thinking about what makes a team motivated. This is another great book I really recommend. It's by Daniel Pink. It's called Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. There's also a great TED Talk on this if you want the short version. And he's identified 3 things that matter. And he did this through a study at MIT, where, again, they did a really large study looking at innovation in teams. So really looking at that kind of high knowledge work that we all do, right? New ideas, new innovation, and what makes those teams more successful. And all the old methods around like the carrot and stick thing of the more you incentivize them, the more you gave them bonuses, all of those things stopped working. The 3 things that worked in various combinations, and it depends on your team, were autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy is our desire to be self-directed, and it increases engagement over compliance. And again, the kind of high knowledge work that we all do, you want an engaged team. You don't want them just following orders and executing exactly what you write on the ticket. Mastery is the urge to get better skills and master our craft, which is hopefully why most of you are here today, to learn more about this job. And purpose is the desire to do something that has meaning and has impact, that kind of big picture, that joke that they have on Silicon Valley about, I want to change the world. It doesn't have to be that big, but it has to be something that's meaningful and that has impact and it feels like you're changing the lives of people around you or making someone's life better or saving people money or whatever that goal is. It's something you can buy into and believe in. So you got the team, now you have to figure out how to lead. And again, everything comes in 3s. There's kind of 3 key ways to think about leadership: authoritative, participative, and delegative. Authoritative is all about setting very clear expectations. The manager makes decisions with little or no input from their team, and it's very task-driven. And it works well when labor is low-skilled, and the leader has all the knowledge and the experience. So this is your basic factory model. The staff doesn't really need to know that much about what they're doing. It's a very simple job. It's very task-driven. They just need to execute existing plans. Obviously not how any of us should be working. Participative gets a little bit more open. The manager still has hands-on guidance. They get input from their team, but they retain the final decision-making. And it's very collaborative. And I think most teams these days, especially in our industry, work like this. But there's one step further that I'm a huge passionate believer in, and it ties into that autonomy point of motivation, which is delegative, which is where you kind of hand all the decision making to the team after giving them high-level guidance so that they have the autonomy to make the decisions, execute on their plans, and is very people-driven. And again, this works well when the workers, the team, has more knowledge or more experience than you as a manager do, which, let's be honest, is almost always the case. Now, autonomy is an interesting topic, I think, because we're not talking about it enough. And I think it's such a big motivator for what we do, and it's such a big motivator for those of you who are entrepreneurs. That's why you're out there doing it. You want that autonomy. You want to be the masters of your own destiny and building your own thing. And it works in teams because it motivates people better. Again, going back to that motivation point. It scales better because it's much easier to spin up a new autonomous team and let them go execute a plan than to try and scale lots of middle managers and lots of processes and figuring out how to do ticketing and handovers. It's also just plain old quick and nimble because all those small teams can stay very small, they can stay autonomous, they can stay agile, and not have to worry too much about communication overhead with other teams. And again, it works because your team is smarter than you are. And most importantly, your team is much, much closer to the customer than you are. They're the ones that are facing those problems every day. They're the ones talking to the customer every day, hopefully. And so they're going to know more about that problem than you ever will. So why would you make the decision instead of them? Now, a lot of people think that this just sounds like anarchy and chaos, and it's not. It can be. It's all about finding the right level, and it's about aligned autonomy or autonomy with accountability, different terms that are coming up for this. And this is a chart by a guy called Henrik Nieberg, who was the agile consultant famous for kind of setting up the Spotify teams, the squads, and things that they run. And he mapped out, like all good consultants do, a 2x2 chart with alignment on one axis and autonomy on the other. And obviously, if you have low alignment and low autonomy, it's basically a micromanaging organization in different culture, people just doing whatever they want. If you have high alignment and low autonomy, it's that very authoritative place where the boss is telling you, go do this thing, this is exactly what you need to execute. It's a conformist culture, and everyone just kind of toes the line. High autonomy, but low alignment, entrepreneurial, chaotic, that's where you start getting anarchy. Obviously, where you want to be, like all good 2x2s, is in the top right. Which is high alignment and high autonomy, which means basically that the boss's job is to make sure that everyone knows what their goals are, knows what they're aligned to do, but then has the freedom to go execute it. Because then you have the autonomy, you're going to execute quickly, it's a collaborative and innovative organization. And some of the tools that you use to do that are thinking about how you set your goals. I believe in trying to set the goals from a bottom-up perspective. So once you have that kind of high picture vision, you have an alignment that, our goal is this for the year. Let the individuals in the teams figure out how can they contribute to that. How are they going to, what levers are they going to pull? What metrics are they going to push? And then boil that up to the top and see if you can actually hit the goal that you want to hit. Because then when you look at it from the top down, then you can see whether you're going to hit those goals, where you have challenges, where you need to add resources, where you need to focus your time. And it's also thinking about incentives, because what you incentivize is what you're going to get. Dilbert, as always, says it best. If you incentivize fixing bugs by paying people a bonus for every bug they fix, they're going to create more bugs. You're going to get what you measure, and that's obviously not what you want. Which brings us on to thinking about how you measure success for that team. So you got the team set up, you got them organized, you got them motivated, they're all autonomous. How do you figure out whether they're successful or not? First of all, I think it's really important to balance qualitative and quantitative. There's a lot of debates online about, it should be totally metrics driven or should be totally kind of ethnographic study driven, go talk to our customers all the time. You really need both. Because without the data, you can't make sense of the feedback you're getting, and without the feedback, you can't make sense of the data. And then it's really about focusing on outcomes for the customer. This is a pretty famous quote, I hope you've heard it before, that people don't want a 1/4-inch drill, they want a 1/4-inch hole. And actually, I would challenge you to think even deeper than that and ask why one more time, if not more. Why do they even want the hole? Are they trying to hang a picture? Maybe they just need one of those sticky hooks. Are they trying to run a cable for their TV through to the next room? Maybe there's a wireless solution to that. Once you really understand the outcomes and the problem that you're trying to solve, it's much easier to understand what the solutions to that can be, because there can be a lot of different ones. And that's why I think you should spend a lot more time focused on defining the problem. There's another great quote from Ken that came out from the interviews we were doing for my book, which is that once you understand the problem at that deep level, measuring success is actually really easy because it's the absence of that problem. So going back to the whole thing, if you know that the person needed to hang a picture, measuring success is the picture on the wall. Then you're done, you've solved the problem. A little simplistic maybe, but it's a good way to start thinking about what are you actually measuring and what are you trying to solve for your customers. Then finally, I think one thing that is really important to think about in our teams and in our startups is balancing discovery versus delivery. Because there's nothing quite so useless as doing with great efficiency that which should not be done at all. And I think as an industry, we've kind of been obsessed with the delivery side of this for a very long time. We have all these amazing methodologies, Agile, Scrum, Lean, Kanban, really old school ones like Six Sigma, Prince2, even Waterfall at one point was an innovative way to build stuff. And they're all focused about how do we ship something that we know we need to ship. And they all come from a factory background. It's all about, we know what the Toyota Prius looks like, how do we most efficiently build a Toyota Prius and ship it to the customer? The challenge is we kind of forget that the person who designed the Toyota Prius doesn't work like that. They work in a design studio, back to this kind of autonomous mode, much more open, much more free. And there are methodologies for that, but especially as product managers historically, we've kind of forgotten about some of those. So there's design thinking, design sprints, discoveries, dual track agile. There are tools out there, but we just, as leaders, have to make sure that we are focusing our time on both sides of that balance. Because I think we have to be careful of the dogma that's out there. So when you're reading the agile books, when you're reading the lean books, it's really easy to think of them as like step-by-step check plans that you need to follow. If you're not doing stand-ups every morning, you're not agile. If you're not doing your weekly retrospectives, you're not agile. And all that's bullshit, to be honest. Because in the Agile Manifesto itself, which I believe in completely, it says that we value responding to change over following a plan. And that's the bottom line. We have to figure out what works for us and our teams. We have to take the bits of the process that work when we're executing for our customers and not just follow a plan. So just to wrap up, John Maeda, who's an amazing designer, said, don't forget the people make the stuff. Relations make the bigger stuff. So if you get the relations and the people part right, everything else will follow. So just to recap, assemble your team, Avenger style, diverse, cross-functional, co-located ideally. Set them up for success by thinking about psychological safety, giving them autonomy, giving them purpose, giving them a mission. And then make sure that they're balancing discovery and delivery. Are they out talking to their customer as often as possible, or are they just focused on shipping tickets? Because why is more important than what or when. Finally, product leadership is not about product, it's about people. There's some read more stuff here, like I talked about. If you go to Google's rework, is called rework with google.com. They have all that data that they've shared from their Project Aristotle. Daniel Pink's Drive and Simon Sinek's Start With Why. And of course, I have to plug my own book at the end, which is coming out any week now. And it's based on these interviews that we've been doing with nearly 100 product leaders around the world. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you around.
Thanks for the talk. Part of a group of CEOs that talked about cross-functional teams before. What they had found, they had built teams from scratch up to about 60 or 70 people or so. They found that when they tried to implement cross-functional teams too early, that it didn't seem to work for them, and functional teams seem to work better in practice. So I'm just curious what you think of company maturity and whether or not that matters in this.
I think company maturity, I need more volume on this one. Company maturity probably does have an impact, you're right. I mean, I think when you're under 10 people, everyone needs to do everything anyway, so that is just probably one giant functional team. I think the challenge is as you start scaling, a lot of it actually comes down to what product you're building, I think, as opposed to the maturity of the company, because it's more about, does it make sense to have different teams focused on different areas of the product, right, or the experience. So another example from TransferWise is actually how they think about when they mean cross-functional teams that have autonomy to do whatever they want, they really mean it as well, which I think is another thing most teams don't think about. So for example, their online marketing team has, of course, designers, developers in it. And if they need to optimize a user flow from a Facebook ad all the way through to sign up, they don't just have power to change the ad and like the landing page like most marketing teams would do. They can actually go all the way through the user flow. So they're allowed to touch any part of the code. They're allowed to tweak whatever they need to. And I think it's that kind of complete openness that starts making it work, because that team can literally go change the user sign-up flow, the dashboard, to make sure that they're hitting their goals. It gets sticky and messy, like teams clash with each other and they clash over the dashboard and things like that. But that's better than having kind of that queuing system that means the dashboard never gets changed to optimize that flow for that user. So I think there's some things around cross-functional where people have kind of done a little half-assed almost, and then it might not be as optimized. But I also think more than company stage, it's probably the product. So if it's one monolithic product or one solid user flow, then it might make more sense to get more throughput, which means you might want to have functional teams. Whereas if there's lots of different experiences, like different throughputs or different types of users, different personas, then it makes sense to have teams assigned to each of those. I hope that helps. I think the problem is there's no one right answer for all of this, right?
More questions? Okay, I'll take that.
Hi, thanks again for the great talk. Well, what about purpose? So let's say, okay, you're working at a company and the industry is clear, the product is quite clear, the product idea at least is clear. How can I give them more purpose than that? What I try to do on a task level is, okay, just imagine a customer can do this or that, and that's why it's value. Or is it what you mean with purpose, or is there more?
I think the key with autonomy, mastery, and purpose is getting the balance of them, right? So you don't have to max out all of them. Like, I don't think any company in the world can do that unless you can somehow let someone rebuild an amazing new tool on new software for like a volunteering organization or something. Like, you're not going to be able to max out purpose and autonomy and mastery. It's figuring out like what are your team motivated by, and if you can't like max out purpose, if it's an e-commerce tool or something, like we're just selling things and we're selling nice things, like it's not a bad business, but it's just a business, right? Then make sure you're let them have autonomy and mastery, if that makes sense. So it's making sure that they're in balance as much as anything else. And I think it's important to realize, again, like that's why it's such a joke on the Silicon Valley TV show, right? They're like, we're going to change the world, because like every company isn't going to do that. And that's okay. That's not a bad thing. That doesn't have to be that super high purpose. But I think there is something basic in what you're already saying around having enough purpose that you feel like you're solving a customer problem, whatever, even if it's just cheaper shoes or something. That's still like you have a purpose, which is I'm going to help the customer. And then if they have enough autonomy and mastery, then that can be enough. Does that make sense?
I would be interested in some of your experiences with actually introducing product thinking within a company, because quite often, like especially like smaller startups, they bring in a product manager thinking they will fix things, and they will kind of bring the right culture, like they speed up the development team, but actually at the core is also that the product itself has or the company has a product thinking. So how can you help the company develop this?
I think ultimately product manager's job is about communication, so they should be communicating that process. I think it depends. If the organization is kind of resistant to the change, I think the one thing that you can do is really start small, right? And do show rather than tell. So find one little thing that you can change and show how product thinking can impact that. So a good example of even a big organization was we had a speaker on the conference last year called Maria Giudice, who's the Chief Experience Officer, I believe, at Autodesk. And she came into that organization to like change it from a very product-oriented shipping software boxes to a kind of full end-to-end experience company. And the first thing she did in their first 90 days kind of thing was actually change the footer on the homepage. Like, it's not even that important a part of the product, but she saw an issue and she knew that she could change it with this kind of methodology. And she communicated about it, like, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're doing it, this is the research we have to prove why we need to do it. They made the change, they achieved the number they wanted to do. And that kind of started teaching people in the organization that this is a valuable way to work. And then they went on to bigger and bigger and bigger things. And like a year or two later, she's like, right, now we're going to take all these 100 products and make it into one experience. So like she bought herself the trust by showing that this process works to build up to the big thing. And I think that's the same for even if you're just coming into a startup. It's thinking about how can you show that the product kind of thinking, product methodology works, of going out and talking to the customer, figuring out what the problem is, showing that you know what the problem is and how to fix it because of that research, and then that you can actually deliver on what you promise.
In your discovery versus delivery slide, there was a big fat line between the two, and I was wondering, what are the best practices to get rid of that line? And what's the, actually the second question is, what's the perfect week for a product manager? Because like, how much time should I be spending on hiring versus getting for the why versus going through user feedback versus prioritizing? What's the best product manager week, how to spend time?
I think the timing thing is definitely going to change depending on the stage of the product, right? So like, when you're in the very early stage, you should probably be spending 4 days of your week just doing user research and data and stuff like that. And then when you have a bit better picture, then it's maybe 2 days. And then when you're kind of just improving and executing on kind of something after you've hit product market fit, then maybe it's just 1 day a week you're talking to customers, and the rest of the time you're figuring out how to execute on the problems because you already have enough data. So I think that changes. I think to your point about the line, it's a very good point. It's probably a design problem there, that there shouldn't be a line, you're right. And I think that's where some of those methodologies are really interesting, like dual track agile, which is a very kind of iterative looping process that goes and involves everyone. And I also think it's where I again find it really important that the whole team should be part of that process. So I usually also say that product manager's job is actually to prioritize the problem and bring the problem to the team, not the solution. The whole team should be helping come up with a solution. And that involves going through all of that user research together, looking at the videos, and then designing the right thing. Because again, your engineers are creative people as well, right? So everybody should be involved in helping figure out the best possible solution. And that's one of the reasons that launch I was talking about at the beginning of the talk went so well, is because I'd been able to set up the problem and communicate it well enough to everyone in the room. We had a kickoff meeting that involved sales, marketing, design, development. And it was one of the junior developers in the back of the room was like, oh, if that's what we're trying to do, why don't we do this? And I was like, yep, great, first story on the board, that's awesome, that's a great idea, because he had a better understanding of the technology stack than anyone else in the room and could figure out the best possible solution. So I think you're right, it has to be a very kind of iterative process, but the whole team should be involved on both sides ideally. Like the developers, the engineers, they should see the user research. Maybe they're not sitting there all day with the customer, but they should see the videos, they should see the feedback, they should look in on a meeting every once in a while to get that direct feedback. Because there's nothing quite so honest as being able to see a user struggle with your product and then go back, crap, I'm going to fix that. So it's very motivating as well.
Thanks.
Cool. Well, thank you, Martin. I just had one question, actually, because you've been doing this for, more than 20 years? Something like that. And then you went on to interview hundreds of product leaders around the world. And is there one learning that really, really surprised you?
I don't think it was that surprising now that I've been doing the conferences and stuff as well, is that we're all facing the same problems. And I think the main thing that came out in the book, the only kind of structure change is a little bit like the stage of company. So that it's slightly different in a startup versus a mid-sized company to an enterprise. But really, we're all facing the same problems. Whether you're at Google or Facebook or some small startup in Stockholm, you're facing the same challenges, and we're all trying to figure out the same things.
That's pretty cool. That means everyone gets the same chances in a way as well. Okay, cool. Well, big round of applause for Martin. Thanks a lot.
Que la famille